And we're back today talking about magnet writing. I know, contain your excitement. Now, a lot of people assume that non-EO exemplars are easier than EO exemplars. And I will just say I was one of those people. I mean, after all, there's no outcome data, there's no pre and post metrics to worry about. I mean, how hard could it be, right? Well, to my surprise and many others, non-EOs have their own unique challenges. But never fear, because today we're here to walk through a 6-step framework to help you get a good, firm grasp on how to tackle non-EOs and avoid some of the common headaches along the way. So let's talk about it. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Excellence in Nursing. I'm Katie Stevens, and I am a consultant, coach, and educator. And if you've seen our last video on EO exemplars, and I'll make sure to link all of that below, but if you've seen that video, you know that EOs can be a challenge because they require strong outcome data to prove their impact. But really, once you have that outcome data, the EO format is very straightforward. You identify the problem, you describe the intervention, and you prove your impact with numbers with your outcome data. Now, non-EO exemplars, on the other hand, require a completely different approach. They do not have a hard and fast formula per se. And without that structured EO format, it can sometimes feel harder to know where to start and then how to structure the overall exemplar. But once we go through a few things in today's video, I think the process will hopefully become much clearer. So with all of that, today we're going to be walking through a 6-step framework. We're going to be discussing how to break down the SOE statement and find the best example. We're going to be talking about how to gather and organize strong supporting evidence. And then we're going to also be talking about how to structure your narrative so that it flows logically and it meets Magnet's expectations. By the end of this video, my goal is for you to have a clear, straightforward process for tackling your non-EO exemplars so that you can really move forward with confidence and maybe even get a little excited to start writing up all of your great Magnet work in your organization. If you're passionate about nursing excellence and want more Magnet strategies, be sure to hit that like button and the subscribe button so that you don't miss our next video. All right, let's dive into the first step, which is reading the Magnet source of evidence statement carefully. So before you begin writing, I recommend to break down the SOE statement into its key elements. This is really the foundation for your entire exemplar. Think of this as your blueprint. And this may sound super basic, but if you don't fully understand what Magnet is asking for in that statement, it is really easy to get off track. So here's what I recommend. Grab a highlighter or a pen and mark up your key phrases in your SOE statement. And really pay close attention to the words in green in the Magnet manual. Those definitions really matter. If you watched the EO video, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. And also right here, make sure that you keep your Magnet manual within arm's reach at all times during the writing process. You will definitely want to be referencing this consistently to make sure that you are aligned with all of Magnet's criteria, as well as their exact definitions and terminology. As you break down the SOE statement into the key elements, take notice of who needs to be involved: clinical nurses, nurse managers, the chief nursing officer, etc. The SOE will actually tell you exactly who should be a part of the story. The other thing to take notice of is what is the focus of the SOE, and also what must be demonstrated. Is the SOE about interprofessional collaboration, evidence-based practice? It could be shared governance or mentorship, advocacy, etc., etc. So if you start before fully understanding the SOE, you do risk missing some key details or, maybe even getting off track. So if you do this work up front, it will save you a lot of time later. Once you've broken down your SOE statement and you're really clear on what you need to prove or demonstrate, it's time for step 2. This is where you're going to find the right example. And this is what I like to call the matchmaking process. Essentially, you are pairing SOE criteria with a real-life example, project, or initiative inside of your organization. And the example must demonstrate or prove how the key elements of the SOE are present and operationalized in your organization. i.e., what does this look like in real life and in practice? Now, non-EO exemplars do not follow a one-size-fits-all structure. They really vary based on the specific SOE criteria. Some of them actually focus on organizational structures or processes, something like shared governance. Some of them focus on how the organization supports or recognizes nurses. And there are others that focus on individual or team contributions, et cetera, et cetera. There are many different variety of non-EO exemplars, exemplars. So as you look for an example in your organization, really be intentional about selecting one that truly fits the SOE criteria. Now, how do you go about choosing the best example? So first off, make sure that your example directly matches the SOE criteria. If it's about shared decision-making, then the example must demonstrate shared decision-making with strong supporting evidence, I must add. So if your SOE is about interprofessional collaboration, the example should clearly demonstrate how nurses work alongside other disciplines. So you get the idea. Your example really needs to fit the SOE criteria. So really make sure that you take time to verify alignment before you move forward. The other thing you're going to want to do is confirm your timeline. So Magnet requires that all exemplars occur within your 48-month Magnet reporting window. So before you go too far down any of the rabbit holes, make sure that your example really fits within that time frame. Now, here's a tip if you're struggling to find an example. My advice here is to really broaden the conversation. Instead of relying on only one or two people, what I recommend is engaging different stakeholders from across the organization. So pull in clinical nurses, educators, interprofessional team members, other team and committee members. These stakeholders will usually have some really great insights into projects or initiatives that are perfectly aligned to some of your SOE criteria. And one great strategy in doing all of this is to actually host a Magnet SOE story mapping process or activity. Some people call this SOE alignment. And this is where you can bring together key stakeholders again from different departments and start matching real-world examples with each SOE statement. This kind of structured brainstorming not only helps to really surface great exemplars and ideas, but it also really makes sure that you are really thinking broadly across the organization. And right here, if you've been through some sort of process like this before, I would love to hear from you. What is your best advice on tips for identifying strong exemplars? Again, I'd love to hear your insights from your experience, so please drop a comment below. And before we wrap up step 2, here's one last thing I'd like to share, something that I've just learned over the years. I highly recommend having backup examples in mind for each Magnet SOE, if at all possible. Because as you start gathering evidence that we'll talk about in the next step, you might start to realize that your original example doesn't actually have enough supporting documentation. And if you get halfway through all of that evidence gathering and you realize that you don't have enough proof, a backup example can really save you a ton of time and stress instead of, having to start over from scratch. Now, once you've identified an internal example that aligns with the Magnet SOE criteria, the next step, step 3, is to gather up all of your supporting evidence before you start writing. Magnet allows up to 5 strong pieces of evidence for non-EO exemplars, and this is where sometimes teams can run into issues. I either see one of two things. First off, sometimes teams won't gather enough evidence up front, and then that leads to some scrambling down the road. Or number 2, sometimes they might select weak or maybe even incomplete evidence that doesn't fully substantiate the story. And this is exactly why I like to have a backup exemplar. As you start gathering evidence in this step, you may realize that you don't have enough documentation to actually substantiate your original ideas or your story. And if that happens, having a backup example can really save you a ton of time and frustration. I've seen teams have to scrap entire exemplars because they couldn't provide enough evidence to meet the SOE requirement. And that meant wasted time, wasted effort, and then of course, if it happens too late in the game, it can cause a lot of stress and scrambling. So trust me, you do not want to be in that situation. So here's what I recommend. When you're gathering up evidence, first, really cast a wide net. Start by gathering literally everything you can get your hands on, anything that might be relevant to your example. And I like to create a dedicated digital folder where I store all potential documents. This way, everything is really in one place and it makes it much easier to sort through later. Then I recommend checking against Magnet's guidelines. So not all documentation qualifies as supporting evidence. So before you narrow it down, really review the Magnet Manual's evidence guidelines to really make sure that you're collecting something that's actually acceptable. Now, there are many different types of supporting evidence that can be used, including policies and procedures, meeting minutes, emails, newsletters, memos. We're not going to necessarily go through all of them today. Again, check your Magnet Manual for more specifics on what qualifies as strong, acceptable evidence. It's important to note here that just because you gather up a document does not mean that you'll necessarily use it. So this step is really all about collecting everything possible so that you have many different options to choose from when you start to select your strongest, best evidence in the next step. Now that you've gathered up all of your potential supporting evidence, step 4 is about being selective. So this is about choosing the strongest pieces of evidence or documentation that can best support your story. Since Magnet allows up to 5 pieces of evidence, you really want to be strategic here. So not all documents may carry the same weight. So it's really important to select evidence that really makes the strongest possible case for your exemplar. And here are some recommendations for how to prioritize your evidence. First off, think about proof and relevance. So each key element of the SOE should have at least one piece of evidence to back it up. So think about this as, proving each required component. And then each document or piece of evidence really should directly support one of the key SOE elements. So if a document doesn't explicitly back up part of your story, then don't include it. So one of the things that I recommend is ask yourself a couple things. So does this evidence directly prove what I'm claiming? And if I removed this piece of evidence, would my story still stand? Also, make sure that you diversify your evidence types. So I don't recommend submitting 5 meeting minutes. That is not going to give Magnet the full picture of your work. So instead, what I like to do is I like to mix it up. I like to include a large range of evidence if possible, such as a combination of meeting minutes, policies, emails, etc. So what you want to do here is you want to provide a well-rounded view of the work that took place. Lastly, make sure that everything is complete and credible. So every document should have dates, names, and signatures if applicable, because the Magnet appraisers need to see that the work actually happened, and this is really your proof. Right here is a great place to mention that we have an entire blog post dedicated to how to write up non-EO exemplars, and we break down everything we're discussing here today step by step. We give you examples of how to label and organize your evidence, how to reference your evidence naturally within your narrative, and then of course, best of all, we have a full hypothetical non-EO exemplar so you can see exactly what a strong submission looks like. So if you're a visual learner or if you just want an example to compare against your work, I think this will be a great resource for you. I will link it in the description below, so make sure you check that out. All right, now that you've selected and organized your strongest evidence, step 5 is where we start shaping the story. And here's a mistake that I see quite often, is that people jump straight into writing without an outline, and then they end up with a disorganized, meandering story that is hard to follow or maybe doesn't clearly hit all of the SOE criteria. So outlining first really ensures that your narrative stays focused, that it flows logically, and that it really directly aligns with all of the SOE criteria. So here are some recommendations for structuring and outlining your exemplar. So first off, use the key SOE elements as section headings. I really recommend starting by breaking down the SOE statement like we did in step 1, and then you're going to use those key elements and you're going to use those elements as section headings. So this really helps you keep the narrative structured, and then it also helps you make sure that you don't miss any of the required elements in the SOE. Another thing I recommend is to organize the story in a logical, chronological order as much as possible. So Magnet appraisers are reading dozens and dozens of exemplars, so make it easy for them to follow the progression of events. Next, map out how you'll incorporate your supporting evidence within each section. So your supporting documents or your supporting evidence should really help shape how the story unfolds, not just be tacked on at the end. So let your evidence naturally guide the narrative structure. And if you're unsure of how to do this, check out our blog post. It includes a visual example so that you can really see how this works in practice. The last thing that I'll recommend here is to sketch out key points for each section. So before you start writing, take a moment to jot down the main message or main messages that you want to convey in each section. So what's the key takeaway? What's the most important point that you want to communicate? This simple step will really help you stay focused and on track and help you avoid those unnecessary details that could dilute your narrative. And finally, step 6, it is time to pull it all together and write up your narrative. So with your outline and your evidence in place, you're going to start connecting the dots. You're going to start connecting everything together and drafting up your exemplar. The goal now is to really expand the outline and turn your bullet points into a well-supported story. Here are some recommendations for drafting up a strong non-EO exemplar. So first off, start strong and stay focused. So lead each section with a clear, concise point. Don't bury the main idea in unnecessary details. So get straight to what was done, why it mattered, and how it aligns with your SOE. Also, weave your evidence into the story. Don't just list supporting documents at the end. Make sure that you really integrate them naturally into the writing. So again, I think the blog post will be a really great resource here to give you a visual and a better idea of how to do this. Also, build a logical flow. Each section should really connect seamlessly to the next so that your story really unfolds naturally. If your narrative feels disjointed or choppy, make sure that you go back to your outline and you check the overall structure. So ask yourself some things. Does each section naturally and logically lead into the next? Are there any gaps or abrupt transitions? Revisiting your outline can really help you make sure that your exemplar really flows smoothly. And lastly, stay aligned with the SOE criteria. So everything in your exemplar should really directly relate to the SOE statement. So really avoid adding unnecessary details or backstories that don't serve the purpose of proving your example, the project, or the initiative. So every piece of information should really reinforce the key elements that Magnet is looking for. So my advice here is stay focused, stay concise, and intentional with your writing. By following these steps today, you can make sure that your non-EO exemplars are well structured, they are well supported, and they tell a compelling story of nursing excellence. And that's a wrap for today. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button for more insights on magnet recognition and nursing excellence. In our next video, we're going to be diving into how to edit your magnet exemplars, and I'll be sharing my personal editing tips and framework to help make sure that your exemplars are polished and magnet submission ready. And if you're looking for more help, head on over to our blog where we cover several great topics, including today's topic. And then also don't forget to grab some of our free resources. You can download our MPD handbook and the 7-stage magnet designation project guide. They are packed with some really great tips and strategies to help you gain more clarity and confidence in all of your magnet work. And if you're feeling stuck or overwhelmed, or if you need some personalized support or trusted advice on your magnet journey, check out our on-demand consulting services. It's a really great flexible option to be able to work together. So you'll find all of the details in the description below. And as always, don't forget that on the journey to excellence, you are the one that makes all of the difference. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.